The moment Martha Hale shoved the 3 pennies across the counter at Naomi, the coins made a sound so small and final that several people in the store turned to look. "That's all you get," Martha said. Not quietly. She had the kind of voice that carried, and she knew it. 3 cents. That's what your credit's worth in this town. Naomi didn't move. She stood at the counter with Elsie pressed against her side, the little girl's forehead burning through the thin cotton of her dress. The milk was right there on the shelf behind Martha's shoulder. 20 cents a bottle. "My daughter has a fever," Naomi said. "I'll pay you back by the end of the week. I'll clean your floors. I'll do whatever you need." Martha's eyes traveled over her the way a person looks at something they've already decided isn't worth their time. "Every widow in a hard season says that." She pushed the coins closer to the edge of the counter. "Take your 3 pennies, Naomi Hale. There's nothing here for you." Someone near the door coughed. No one said a word. If you've ever stood in a room full of people who could help you and chose not to, you already know what that silence feels like. If you've ever had to look your child in the eye and have no answer for why the world is treating you this way. Stay with this story. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that like button so I know you're here. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Because what Naomi does next, what she survives, what she builds from nothing, it's the kind of story that stays with you long after it's over. Whip. The pennies were cold in her palm. Naomi closed her fingers around them and picked up Elsie without a word. The child didn't ask questions. At 4 years old, Elsie had already learned that some silences weren't for asking through. She pressed her cheek against her mother's neck and breathed in shallow, ragged pulls that Naomi could feel against her collarbone, like something breaking in slow motion. Outside, the air hit them both. October in Iron Creek had a particular cruelty to it, not the deep cold that at least felt honest, but the in-between kind, wet and biting, that seeped under your coat and sat in your chest. The street was mostly empty. A man loading crates outside the feed store glanced up at them and looked away. 2 women on the far side of the road kept walking when they saw her, pulling their coats tighter, speeding their steps. Naomi had grown up believing that a community was something that held people together during hard times. She had believed that her whole life, right up until the week after they buried her husband and the nature of Iron Creek revealed itself to her with a kind of quiet efficiency she still hadn't fully recovered from. Daniel Hale had died the way men in mining towns sometimes die. Not in a dramatic cave-in that at least warranted a story, but in a slow accumulation of things that went wrong. A bad winter. A bad cough that turned into something worse. 3 weeks in a borrowed bed in the back room of the company house, and then nothing. He was 31 years old. He left her with Elsie, a pile of company debt that the foreman had presented to her the morning of the burial, and the understanding that the company house was no longer hers to live in after the end of the month. She had done everything right. She had asked for work at every business in Iron Creek that she could walk to. She had offered to cook, to clean, to mend clothes, to watch children. She had gone to each door with her hat in her hand and her pride somewhere she couldn't find it anymore. And one by one, the doors had closed. Not with cruelty, most of them. Just with a kind of careful distance, as though poverty were something a person could catch, and none of them were willing to risk it. 3 weeks of that. And now Martha Hale. No relation, just a coincidence of married names that sometimes made Naomi feel like the universe had a mean sense of humor, standing behind a general store counter with 20-cent milk on the shelf behind her and a sick 4-year-old right in front of her, and still nothing. Naomi stood on the edge of the wooden boardwalk in front of the store and looked down at the pennies in her palm. 3 cents. She could buy a small heel of bread with that if the bakery was still selling the ends. Bread wasn't milk. Bread wasn't what Elsie needed. But bread was what 3 pennies bought. Elsie shifted in her arms and made a small sound. Not crying. Elsie almost never cried anymore, which was the part that scared Naomi the most. A child who has been hungry long enough stops crying for food. They just go quiet. "I know," Naomi said. "Almost home." Home was 1 room above the blacksmith's stable, rented for $2 a month that she had not yet figured out how to pay. The blacksmith, a slow-talking man named Hedder, had told her last Tuesday that he needed something by the 1st of November, or he'd have to let the space to someone who could actually pay for it. He hadn't said it meanly. That somehow made it worse. She started walking. She was halfway down Main Street when the wagon slowed beside her. She didn't look up immediately. Wagons passed on this street all day long, and she had stopped expecting any of them to have anything to do with her. But this one slowed to match her pace, and that made her glance sideways. The man on the bench was older than she'd first guessed, mid-40s maybe, with weathered hands and a face that looked like it had spent most of its life pointed into the wind. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Elsie. Not the way some men looked at a child they were curious about, not with the sharp interest of someone calculating something. He was looking at Elsie the way a person looks at something that hits them somewhere they weren't ready to be hit, like something in his face had just given without him meaning to let it. "She's sick?" he said. "She's fine," Naomi said, and kept walking. The wagon kept pace. "She doesn't look fine." Naomi stopped. The man stopped the horse. She turned to face him fully, because she had discovered in the last 3 weeks that the fastest way to end an unwanted conversation was to look directly at the person having it. Most people didn't like that. This man looked back at her without blinking. "I don't take charity," she said. "I didn't offer any," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Elsie coughed, a small dry sound that seemed to land somewhere between them in the street. "What kind of work?" Naomi said. "Everything," the man said. "Cooking, mending, whatever needs doing around the place. I've got a ranch up in the mountains, Pine Ridge. It's about 2 hours north." He paused. "I haven't had anyone out there helping since my wife—" He stopped, started again. "Place is getting away from me." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. The rational part of her, the part her mother had cultivated carefully, the part that had always told her to think before she moved, to know who she was dealing with, to never climb onto a stranger's wagon. That part was saying several things at once, none of them encouraging. The other part of her was looking at Elsie's face and counting backward from 3. "What's your name?" she said. "Silas Boone." "You got people in town who know you?" He considered that. "The livery on 4th knows me. Hedder, the blacksmith, knows who I am." Naomi shifted Elsie to her other hip. Hedder. She could ask Hedder. She could do that right now, and the man would wait, or he wouldn't, and she'd know something from that either way. "Wait here," she said. She walked back to the blacksmith's stable without hurrying. Hedder was in the back, working something with a file, and he looked up at her with the careful expression of a man who knows someone is about to ask him something. "Silas Boone," she said. "You know him?" Hedder put the file down. "Mountain man. Ranch up north of here, past the ridge line. Been coming through town for about 12 years. Quiet. Pays what he owes." He paused, and she could hear him deciding whether to say the next thing. "Lost his wife and his son about 4 years back. Fever took them both same week. He pretty much stopped coming to town after that." He looked at her. "Why?" "He's offering work," Naomi said. Hedder's expression did something complicated. "He say what kind?" "General ranch work. He says the place is getting away from him." Hedder picked up the file again and turned back to what he was doing. "Silas Boone is the most straightforward man I've dealt with in 30 years of doing business in this town," he said. "And I've dealt with a lot of men." That wasn't a ringing endorsement of his personality or his living situation or the wisdom of going anywhere with a stranger, but it was something. In a town that had given her nothing but closed doors and 3 cold pennies, it was something. She walked back to the wagon. "I'll need to get our things," she said. Silas nodded once. "I'll wait." She had 20 minutes worth of things to gather. A canvas bag, a change of clothes for each of them, the quilt that had been her mother's, and a small tin box with the papers from Daniel's burial and the letter from the company about the debt. She took one last look at the room above the stable, the water stain on the ceiling, the draft from the east wall, the low hook where Elsie had started hanging her coat, and she picked up the bag and walked down the stairs. Hedder was standing at the bottom. He didn't say anything. He just held out a small glass bottle, and when she looked at it, she recognized it. Milk, still cold. "You don't owe me anything for that," he said, before she could speak. She stood there for a moment longer than she meant to. "Thank you," she said, because she didn't have anything else, and it wasn't enough. but it was what she had. She climbed onto the wagon bench beside Silas Boone and settled Elsie between them. The child was already leaning toward the warmth of the man beside her with the unconscious trust of the very young, and Silas held himself very still, as though sudden movement might startle something. Naomi uncorked the bottle and held it to Elsie's lips. The little girl drank in long, slow pulls, her eyes closing halfway with something that looked almost like relief. They pulled out of Iron Creek without anyone seeing them go, or if anyone saw, they didn't think enough of it to wave. The road north was rough and unpaved past the edge of town, winding up through scrub pine and granite outcroppings, and Silas drove it with the ease of a man who'd made the trip so many times it had stopped requiring his full attention. He didn't fill the silence with talk. Naomi had spent 3 weeks surrounded by people who talked too much and said nothing, and the quiet felt improbably like a relief. "How long has she been sick?" he asked after about 20 minutes. 4 days, Naomi said. "The fever started small and it's been going up. There's a woman in the valley, halfway between the ranch and the ridge road. She knows medicine better than the doctor in Iron Creek, and the doctor in Iron Creek knows it." He paused. "We can stop on the way up." Naomi looked at him sideways. He was watching the road. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Not accusatory. She genuinely wanted to know. He was quiet for a moment. "I needed help at the ranch," he said. "That's true." "But?" He didn't answer right away. The horse picked its way around a rut in the road, and the wagon rocked, and Elsie stirred and settled again. "I had a little girl," Silas said. "She was 3 when she died." He didn't say anything else. Naomi looked out at the road ahead. The mountains were starting to take shape in the distance, solid and gray-blue against the overcast sky. She thought about what Hedder had told her. Fever took them both same week. "I'm sorry," she said. "Yeah," he said. "That was all." They stopped at the woman's house, a small square building off the side of the road with a kitchen garden that was mostly put to bed for the season. The woman, whose name was Doris Fane, came to the door before Silas even knocked, as though she'd heard the wagon coming. She looked at Elsie with quick, practical eyes and asked 3 questions in rapid succession: how long, what color, what kind of cough, and had them inside, and Elsie laid out on her kitchen table in under a minute. "Lung fever starting," Doris said, her hands moving across Elsie's chest with a certainty that Naomi recognized as the thing you got after years of doing something, until it stopped being difficult and started being instinct. "You caught it early. Good." "Is she going to be all right?" Naomi said. Doris looked at her over the child. "She's going to be all right," she said, and something in the way she said it told Naomi she meant it, not that she was saying it to be kind. Doris gave them a small bottle of something dark that smelled of pine and told them to give Elsie a spoonful in warm water twice a day. She refused payment. She looked at Naomi for a moment when they were leaving, with the particular look of someone who's heard things and is choosing what to do with them. "Martha Hale should be ashamed of herself," Doris said, and shut her door. They reached Pine Ridge Ranch as the last light was going out of the sky. Naomi had been constructing a picture of it in her mind for the last 2 hours of the drive, and the ranch that existed in front of her was different from all the versions she'd built. The house was bigger than she'd expected, but not well maintained, not neglected in a broken window way, but in the way of a place where someone had been keeping up with what was strictly necessary and letting everything else slide. The fence on the east side of the yard was leaning. The porch had a plank that needed replacing. The kitchen garden, visible through a gate to the side of the house, had been left to go ragged at the end of the season. It was a place that had stopped being cared for and was waiting. Silas unhitched the horse in silence while Naomi carried Elsie inside. The house smelled like wood smoke and something older, the particular smell of a place that had once been lived in and had mostly gone back to being just functional. There was a bedroom off the main room, a kitchen at the back, and a sleeping loft above. She put Elsie down on the bed in the main bedroom and pulled the quilt over her. The child was already almost asleep, the medicine from Doris having begun its work in the last hour of the drive. Naomi went back to the main room and stood in the middle of it. She had arrived. She had 3 pennies in her pocket, a sick child in the next room, and a stranger who had just put a roof over their heads for reasons she understood about halfway and was still working on the rest of. She was 28 years old. She had no idea what came next. But she was not standing on a cold street in Iron Creek with no one looking at her. And for the moment, that was the only arithmetic that mattered. Silas came inside with a load of wood for the fireplace and set it down by the hearth without speaking. He built the fire with the efficiency of a man who'd done it alone 1,000 times, and the room began to warm. "The loft is yours," he said, straightening up. "I'll take the bedroom off the kitchen." He looked at her. "Your daughter can have the main bedroom until she's better. More heat from the fire reaches it." "That's your room," Naomi said. "I haven't slept well in it in 4 years," he said flatly. "She can have it." He went to the kitchen, and she heard the sound of a kettle being set over coals. He came back a few minutes later with a mug of something, plain hot water with a bit of something dried in it, she thought, and set it on the table by the bedroom door. "For her when she wakes," he said. Naomi looked at him. He looked back at her. She was starting to understand that this was what the man did instead of conversation. "He handed you hot water. He built your fire. He stopped the wagon in the middle of a street in a town he was passing through because he saw a child who looked the way his own child used to look. And he did the only concrete thing he could think to do. He didn't ask to be thanked for it. He didn't seem to expect anything in particular from her. He just moved through the house with the quiet practicality of someone who had learned to live alone and was making room anyway. It made her trust him more than any speech could have. It also made her incredibly sad for him, in a way she didn't think he'd want her to say out loud. "I'll start earning my place tomorrow," she said. "All right," he said. She went to check on Elsie. The little girl was sleeping with both fists curled under her chin, her breathing already more even than it had been all week. The color in her face was still too high, but it was different. Not the dry heat of something getting worse, but the softer flush of something that was being worked on. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed and put her hand on Elsie's back and felt her breathe. She thought about Iron Creek. She thought about the Pennies and the general store and the row of closed doors and the specific way silence sounds when a room full of people has decided you don't matter. She thought about Martha Hale's face when she pushed those coins across the counter. And then she thought about the way Silas Boone had looked at Elsie on that street, not with curiosity, not with calculation, but with something unguarded that he probably hadn't known was visible. She had climbed onto a stranger's wagon with a sick child and 3 pennies. She had left behind the only place she'd known since her marriage, a place that had made itself very clear it didn't want her. She had no guarantee about what came next. She had no safety net, no plan, and no one waiting for her to succeed or fail except the small person breathing steadily under her hand. But the fire was going. The roof held. And for the first time in 3 weeks, her daughter was asleep instead of awake, and too weak to ask for things Naomi couldn't give her. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was more like the cleared space where hope eventually grows. Naomi Hale had learned in the past 3 weeks to take what she could get and work with it. Whatever Pine Ridge Ranch was, whatever it turned out to be, it was hers to work with now. She tucked the quilt closer around Elsie's shoulders, stood up, and went to help with whatever needed doing next. The first morning at Pine Ridge Ranch, Naomi woke before the light came in and lay still for a moment, listening. She had slept in the loft, on a narrow straw mattress under 2 wool blankets that smelled of cedar and disuse. The fire below had burned down to coals sometime in the night, and the cold had crept back into the upper air, and she could see her breath in the dark. Below her, she heard Elsie's breathing. She had moved her daughter's sleeping mat close to the hearth before going up herself, and the sound was cleaner than it had been in days, steadier. She climbed down before she let herself feel anything about that. Feeling things took time, and time was not currently something she had in surplus. The kitchen was cold. The stove hadn't been cleaned in what looked like several weeks, and the wood box beside it was half empty and filled with pieces that were too large to light easily. Naomi found a hatchet hanging on a peg by the back door, went outside into the gray pre-dawn, and split wood for 20 minutes in the freezing air until she had enough to start a proper fire. Her hands were not good at it yet. She'd done it before, but not regularly, and the hatchet kept catching at angles that sent chips flying sideways instead of clean, but she got there. By the time Silas came out of the back bedroom, she had the stove going, the kettle heating, and a pan of cornbread batter ready to go in. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the stove, then at her. "You didn't have to start that," he said. "I know," she said. He sat down at the kitchen table without further comment. This, she was beginning to understand, was the man's primary mode of operation. He said what was necessary, accepted what was offered, and didn't make a production out of either. She put the cornbread in and turned to look at him. He had the particular stillness of someone who had grown accustomed to mornings alone, sitting with his hands wrapped around nothing yet, waiting for the coffee, not filling the quiet with noise. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just what it was. "I need to know what you need done," she said, "in order of what's most pressing. I can see the east fence is going, and the garden needs to be properly put to bed before the hard freeze, and the wood supply is low. But you know this place and I don't, so tell me." He looked at her for a moment. "Most women would want to know what they're getting paid first," he said. "Most women weren't standing in Iron Creek yesterday with 3 pennies," she said. "Tell me what needs doing." He did. He wasn't a man who organized his thoughts quickly into neat lists, and what came out was rough and jumped around. The north pasture fence, the root cellar that needed to be restocked before winter fully arrived, the 2 pigs that hadn't been properly dealt with before the cold set in, the roof of the barn that had a section that would not make it through a heavy snowfall. He talked, and she listened. And by the time the cornbread was done, she had a working understanding of the shape of the problem. The problem was that one man could not maintain this ranch alone. Not adequately. Not if the ranch was going to be anything more than a place where things slowly deteriorated at a pace he could just barely keep ahead of. She set the cornbread on the table and went to check on Elsie. The little girl was awake, sitting up on her mat by the fire with her quilt around her shoulders, looking at the low coals with the serious expression she got when she was thinking hard about something she wasn't yet sure how to ask. "Hungry?" Naomi said. "Where are we?" Elsie said. "A ranch in the mountains. We're going to be staying here for a while." Elsie considered that. "Is it safe?" Naomi crouched down in front of her and put a hand on her forehead. The fever had dropped, still warm, not gone, but clearly less. "Yes," she said. "It's safe." "The man," Elsie said. "He has sad eyes." Naomi looked at her daughter, 4 years old, and she said things like that. "He's had some hard times," Naomi said carefully. "But he's a good man." Elsie seemed to file that away. "Okay," she said, with the straightforward acceptance of a child who's learned to trust her mother's assessment of strangers. "Can I have breakfast?" The days that followed were not easy, and they were not graceful, and Naomi would not have described them as anything other than a series of problems that needed solving before the next set arrived. The root cellar was low on preserved goods, so she spent 3 days going through what was salvageable and making hard decisions about what needed to be used immediately versus what could be stretched through to spring. The garden had enough left in it, frost-hardy things, kale and turnips, and a few carrots that had been left in the ground too long but were still good enough to supplement what they had, and she harvested everything she could reach before the next cold snap came in. Silas worked outside from first light to last. She worked inside and sometimes outside with him, and they developed, without discussing it, a natural division of tasks that had nothing to do with what was traditionally a man's work or a woman's work, and everything to do with who was better at what and who was already doing it. He handled the livestock and the heavy structural repairs. She handled the food, the house, the supplies management, and anything that required sustained attention to detail that he, not unintelligent, but constitutionally restless, wasn't suited for. Elsie recovered in 5 days. By the 6th, she was following Silas around the yard at a distance, watching him work with the livestock with the focused attention she gave anything that interested her. He was aware of her doing it. Naomi could see him register the small shadow trailing him and then deliberately not make a thing of it, just going about his work while the child observed. On the 7th day, Elsie asked him what the horse's name was. Silas stopped what he was doing, repairing the gate latch on the south corral, and looked at her. "Luther," he said. "That's a person's name," Elsie said. "He has a person's personality," Silas said. "Stubborn, and thinks he knows better." Elsie considered this with great seriousness. "Can I feed him something?" Silas produced an apple from his coat pocket. He handed it to Elsie and showed her, without touching her hands, how to hold it flat so she wouldn't get bitten. Naomi watched from the porch, and she couldn't have said what she was feeling exactly, only that it occupied the same region of her chest where things that mattered lived. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Naomi found the account books. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been looking for a pen in the main room's small desk, and the ledger was sitting open on the shelf above it, not hidden, just sitting there the way things sit when someone has stopped caring whether anyone sees them. She wouldn't have read it except that the numbers visible on the open page were in such obvious disorder that her eye couldn't help parsing them. She sat down and read the last 2 years of Pine Ridge Ranch's finances. The ranch was not failing. That was the first thing she understood. The land was solid, the cattle operation was functional, the income from the fall beef sales was adequate. What was wrong was the spending, not extravagance, nothing like that, but a man who had stopped tracking things carefully, who was paying too much for some supplies because he no longer drove to multiple towns to compare prices, who had some equipment purchases that made no sense for the size of the operation he was running, small hemorrhages that added up. She closed the ledger and went back to the kitchen. That evening, after Elsie was asleep, she put the ledger on the kitchen table and sat down across from Silas. He looked at it, then at her. "I wasn't going through your things," she said. It was on the shelf." "I know," he said. "I left it there." She wasn't sure what to do with that. "Your income is fine," she said. "Your costs are the problem. You're paying Garrett's Supply $1.20 per hundredweight for grain when Tillman's in the valley charges 90 cents and will deliver if you give them a week's notice. That alone is about $30 a year," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "Then why?" He picked up his coffee cup and looked into it. "Because going to Tillman's means going through the valley, and the valley road goes past the house where Eliza and the boy are buried." He set the cup down. "So I stopped going through the valley." The quiet in the kitchen was a different kind after that. Naomi sat with it for a moment. "All right," she said. "I can make the Tillman's trips." He looked at her. "You don't need to do that." "It's $30 a year," she said. "We need $30 a year. I can make the trip." He didn't argue. He just nodded once and looked at the ledger. "There's other things like that," he said. "Things I've been paying more for or not doing because—" He stopped. "Because they go past something," she said. "Yeah." "Tell me what they are." He told her. It took a while. By the time they were done, she had a list of 6 things that had been slowly bleeding the ranch's efficiency for 4 years. Not because Silas Boone was incompetent, but because grief had routed him around certain roads and certain people and certain towns, and he had let the roots harden into habit without accounting for what they cost. She was not sentimental about this. She recognized it for what it was. A man who had been managing his loss the only way he could figure out, but she also recognized that her job here was to make this ranch work, and making it work meant addressing the list. She started addressing it the following week. She drove to Tillman's on a Wednesday. She negotiated a standing delivery arrangement and talked them down to 85 cents per hundredweight by committing to a volume they could plan around. She stopped at 3 other businesses in the valley on the same trip and came home with information about better pricing on 2 more items on her list. She did not go past the small cemetery on the valley road because she knew which road that was, and she took the longer fork around it without making any decisions about it out loud. When she got back, Silas was in the barn doing something to Luther's left foreleg. He looked up when she came in. 85 cents, she said. Delivery on Wednesdays. He stared at her. You bargained them down from 90? Volume commitment, she said. They wanted predictability more than the extra 5 cents. Most suppliers do. He kept looking at her. She couldn't read his expression exactly, but there was something in it that she hadn't seen there before. Where'd you learn that? He said. My father had a dry goods store, she said. I kept his books from the time I was 12. She shrugged. Doesn't matter what you're selling. Predictable buyers get better prices. She went back to the house. She didn't think about the look on his face until later, when she was putting Elsie to bed, and then she thought about it briefly and set it aside. She had things to do. She didn't have time to think about what it meant when a man looked at you like he'd forgotten something was possible and you'd just reminded him. November deepened. The first real snowfall came on a Tuesday, heavy and fast, and they spent the day before it moving livestock, reinforcing the barn's weak section, and getting everything that could freeze inside or under cover. It was the first time they worked side by side in sustained close quarters for an entire day, and Naomi discovered that Silas worked the way she did, without a lot of commentary, just moving from one thing to the next with the focus of someone who has calculated the variables and is executing the plan. It was oddly comfortable. More comfortable than it should have been, maybe. At one point, carrying the far end of a heavy feed chest, she misjudged a step in the mud, and her end went down, and the chest shifted, and Silas grabbed it and grabbed her elbow at the same time, and for a moment they were very close in the gray pre-snow air. He let go of her elbow immediately. "You all right?" "Fine," she said. "Let's move it to the left." They moved it to the left. Neither of them said anything else about it. That evening, with the snow coming down outside and the house tight and warm for the first time since she'd arrived, Elsie sat on the floor in front of the fire with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of brown paper she'd found somewhere, drawing something with great concentration. Silas was at the table with a harness he was mending. Naomi was letting out the seams of one of Elsie's dresses that she was growing out of, finally, the first sign of real weight gain the child had shown in months. "What are you drawing?" Silas asked Elsie. "Us?" Elsie said, without looking up. Naomi kept her eyes on her stitching. From the corner of her eye, she saw Silas's hands pause on the harness. "Can I see?" he said. Elsie brought the paper over and held it up. Naomi glanced at it. 3 figures rendered in rough charcoal, one tall and angular, one medium height, one very small, all of them standing in front of what was clearly meant to be a house with smoke coming from the chimney. Silas looked at it for a long moment. "That's a good house," he said. "It's this house," Elsie said, matter of fact. "That's you. That's Mama. That's me." "I can see that," he said. His voice was careful in a way that Naomi recognized, the way voices get when something has gotten through the guard and the person is working hard to stay level. "You're a good artist." "I know," Elsie said, and went back to the fire. Naomi bit a thread and didn't say anything. But something in the room had shifted slightly, the way rooms shift when something true has been said out loud that everyone was already quietly aware of. The letter arrived on the 1st of December. It came with the supply wagon that made the valley run once a week, delivered by the driver to the gate along with their feed delivery. Silas brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, and Naomi noticed it was addressed to her in a handwriting she didn't recognize, precise and formal, the handwriting of someone who'd been educated to impress. She opened it. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table very carefully, the way you set things down when your hands are not entirely steady and you don't want anyone to see that. Victor Hale, Daniel's older brother. She had met him once, at the wedding, and the impression she'd come away with was of a man who measured every room he entered and calculated immediately where he sat in the hierarchy of it. He had looked at her, Daniel's wife, a dry goods man's daughter from a small town, with a smile that was perfectly calibrated to convey both warmth and a clear sense of where she ranked relative to him. She had not thought of Victor Hale in months, not since the week after Daniel died, when he'd sent a brief note of condolence that had said the right things in a way that managed to feel like something other than sympathy. The letter was from his attorney. It was 3 pages long and very professionally written, and what it said, stripped of the legal language, was this. Victor Hale was petitioning for custody of Elsie, his brother's only child, on the grounds that Naomi Hale had demonstrated an inability to provide adequate care and stable living circumstances for the girl, and had further demonstrated poor judgment by removing the child from the community and taking her to live with an unrelated man of unknown character in an isolated location. The letter cited several witnesses from Iron Creek. It cited the company debt. It cited the fact that she had left without notifying anyone of her destination. It requested her response through her legal counsel, and noted that a court date had been set for the 2nd week of February. She did not have legal counsel. She did not have money for legal counsel. She had 30 extra cents a hundredweight on grain deliveries and a half-repaired east fence and a daughter who was finally gaining weight. She folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her apron and finished making supper. She fed Elsie. She got Elsie to bed. She came back to the kitchen and found Silas still at the table, waiting in the way he waited for things. Without impatience, without making a production of it, just there. She put the letter on the table. He read it. He read it slowly, which she hadn't expected. He struck her as someone who read fast. But he went through all 3 pages carefully, and when he was done, He set it down and looked at the table for a moment before he looked at her. "Tell me about Victor Hale," he said. She told him. Not everything. She didn't have much to tell, one meeting and one note and 3 pages of legal threat. But she told him what she knew and what she'd observed and what her instincts told her about the kind of man he was. Silas listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "He doesn't want Elsie," he said. Naomi looked at him. "What do you mean?" "A man who wanted the child would have shown up when her father was dying, or after." He tapped the letter. "This is about something else, control maybe, or the principle of the thing. He doesn't want you to have her because that means you win something." Naomi thought about that. She thought about the smile at the wedding, the calibration of the room. "You might be right," she said. "Doesn't matter if I'm right," he said. "He's got an attorney and a court date and witnesses from Iron Creek, and you've got—" He stopped. "Nothing," she said. "I've got nothing." "You've got me," he said, and then seemed to hear how that sounded because his jaw tightened slightly, and he looked away. "I mean, the ranch, as a residence, as—" He stopped again. "I know what you meant," she said, but the problem was the residence wasn't enough. She knew enough from her father's dealings with the county clerk's office to know that a widow living in an unmarried arrangement with a man she wasn't related to was, in the language of frontier courts, not a point in her favor. Victor's attorney would make something of it. They already had. She looked at Silas. He was looking at the letter again. "If I were your wife," she said carefully, "legally, it would be different." He looked up at her. "I'm not saying—" she started. "I know what you're saying," he said. "It doesn't have to be anything other than what it is," she said. "A practical arrangement. There are people who do this." He was quiet for a long time. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like running water. "Elsie would need to stay here," he said finally, "not just for the court case. She'd need to stay here after." "I know that," Naomi said. "And you'd need to stay." "I know that too." He picked up the letter and set it back down. "I'm not an easy person to live with," he said. It wasn't self-pity. It was just stated, like a practical constraint she should factor in. "I haven't found the easy ones to be worth much," she said. He almost smiled at that. Almost. It was there for just a second at the corner of his mouth before it went away. "Then I suppose we should go see the judge in Harlan County about a license," he said. They went to Harlan County on a Thursday. Elsie came with them because there was no one to leave her with, and also because Elsie, once informed that her mother and Silas were going to be married, had announced with complete calm that she wanted to come. The county clerk's office was a small room with a coal stove and a territorial flag on the wall, and the judge, a compact man named Aldridge who smelled of pipe tobacco and looked like he'd been sleeping in his chair, married them in 11 minutes with Elsie standing between them and holding both their hands without being asked. "You may consider yourselves legally wed," Judge Aldridge said, making a note in his book. "That's it?" Elsie said. "That's it," Naomi said. Elsie looked at Silas. "Does that mean you're my papa now?" The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds. Naomi watched Silas's face do something she'd only seen it do once before, in the kitchen, when Elsie had shown him the drawing, that careful, controlled quality of a man who is working hard to stay level when something has found the unguarded place. "If you want me to be," he said. Elsie considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Then she nodded once, satisfied, and let go of both their hands and went to look at the territorial flag. Silas looked at the floor. He breathed in once, slowly, the kind of breath that is doing work. Naomi said nothing. Some things didn't need witness. They drove home through the valley, and this time Naomi did not take the longer fork around the cemetery road, because she was not the one driving and it wasn't her decision to make. Silas turned at the valley fork and drove past the small gated plot on the east side of the road without slowing, without looking, with exactly the kind of steady forward attention that costs something and doesn't show the cost on the outside. She didn't comment on it. She sat beside him on the wagon bench with Elsie between them and watched the mountain road open up ahead of them, the pine ridgeline dark against the winter sky, the smoke already beginning to show above the ranch as the coals from the morning's fire still breathed in the stove. They got home, and there was work to do, the same as every day. Silas unhitched Luther and she went in to start supper. Elsie, restored to energy and now operating at full capacity after weeks of recovery, informed them both at the table that she intended to name the smaller of the two barn cats Aldridge after the judge, because she thought it had the same expression. Silas looked at the cat, which was sitting on the window ledge with the particular expression of an animal that has decided nothing around it is worth its full attention. "That's fair," he said. And for the first time since Naomi had come to Pine Ridge Ranch, all three of them sat at a supper table laughing at the same thing, at the same time, without anyone having planned for it. It lasted about 30 seconds. Then the cat knocked a tin cup off the window ledge and Elsie shrieked, and Silas caught the cup mid-fall, and Naomi realized her cheeks hurt, which was how she discovered she'd been smiling harder than she'd noticed. The letter from Victor Hale's attorney sat on the shelf above the desk. February was still 8 weeks away. The east fence still needed work. The root cellar needed more than it had. There were 100 things that had to be dealt with before the snow got heavy enough to make them harder. But they had a legal marriage and a ranch that was getting stronger by the week, and a little girl who had named the cat after the judge who married her parents. Naomi washed the dishes that evening and thought about what was coming, because she was not someone who let herself believe that a problem had gone away just because the room was warm and the supper was good and something almost like happiness had moved through the house for 30 seconds. Victor Hale had money and lawyers and witnesses and a story he'd been building since the day he decided he wanted it. She had the truth, a practical husband who was not going to back down from anything, and a daughter who was alive and getting stronger every day. She did not know yet whether that was enough, but she intended to find out. The 8 weeks between December and February were the kind of weeks that reveal what people are actually made of, as opposed to what they believe themselves to be under easier conditions. Naomi had always thought of herself as practical, steady, not the kind of woman who came apart under pressure. But the weeks leading up to the court date in Harlan County tested a different thing than steadiness. They tested her ability to sit with uncertainty at close range, day after day, and keep functioning as though the uncertainty weren't sitting right beside her at every meal. She functioned. She kept the house running, managed the supply orders, worked the garden beds under frost cover, and tracked the root cellar inventory, and mended everything that needed mending. She drove to Tillman's on Wednesdays. She helped Silas repair the east fence before the deep freeze made the ground too hard to work post holes. She did all of it the way she'd learned to do hard things, by breaking them into their smallest components and handling one component at a time and not looking too far ahead. But the letter lived on the shelf above the desk, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of a sound that isn't quite audible, not constantly, not consciously, but in the background, always, like a frequency just below what the ear can fully process. Silas, for his part, did something she hadn't expected. He wrote a letter. She found out about it indirectly. He mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, without preamble, on a Thursday evening when she was going over the account books, and he was sharpening a draw knife at the other end of the table. "I wrote to a man named Carver in Harlan," he said. "He's not a full attorney, but he knows procedure. Used to clerk for a judge. He'll look over what we have and tell us if there's anything we're missing." Naomi set down her pen. "When did you do that?" 2 weeks ago." He drew the blade across the whetstone. "He wrote back last week. He's willing to meet with us before the court date." She looked at him. "You didn't tell me." "I wanted to know if he was worth telling you about first." He glanced up. "He is." She took a breath, decided not to make a thing of it. He had done something useful. The fact that he'd done it without telling her was something to address later, when there was time. What did he say in his letter? He said the key issue is going to be characterization. Victor's attorney is going to try to establish you as someone who acts without judgment, the debt, leaving town, coming here. Carver says we need to reframe every one of those things as deliberate choices made under specific constraints, not desperation. There's a difference, legally, between a woman who panics and a woman who makes hard decisions. "I know the difference," Naomi said. "I know you do," he said, "but the judge won't know it unless it's presented that way." They went to see Carver on a Saturday, leaving Elsie with Doris Fane, who had made it clear from their second meeting that she considered herself informally invested in the outcome of this situation. Carver worked out of a room above a leather goods shop in Harlan. A thin man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and a habit of tapping his front teeth with his pen when he was thinking. He read through everything they brought: the original letter from Victor's attorney, the company debt documentation, the marriage license, Silas's land deed and financial records, and a brief account Naomi had written of the specific sequence of events from Daniel's death through their arrival at Pine Ridge. And he asked questions the way someone does when they've read a lot of legal documents and have developed a particular sensitivity to what's missing. "The witnesses from Iron Creek," he said. "Do you know who they are?" "I can guess," Naomi said. "Martha Hale at the general store, possibly the foreman from the mining company. There was a woman named Pratt who lived near our old house." "What will they say?" "That I begged for credit, that I left without telling anyone, that my daughter was in poor condition." She paused. "All of that is true." Carver tapped his teeth. "Here's the thing about true statements, Mrs. Boone. They can be true and still be incomplete. A starving child in a dying town after a father's death is a fact. A mother who responded to that fact by taking decisive action to find better circumstances is also a fact. Victor Hale's people are going to give the judge the first fact and hope he doesn't ask about the second." "So we make him ask," Silas said. "You make him see," Carver said. "There's a difference. Judges don't like being led. You present the full picture and let him draw the conclusion." He spent another hour with them, going over what documentation they had and what they needed to find. He pointed out that the mining company debt, which Victor's attorney had cited as evidence of financial instability, was actually the company's debt, in the company's name, transferred to Naomi by a foreman who likely didn't have the legal authority to do so. That was worth looking into. He also said something else at the end that Naomi turned over in her mind for the rest of the drive home. "The child's going to matter more than anything else in that room," he said. "Not your testimony, not Mr. Boone's financial records. The judge is going to want to know what the child wants and what the child knows. Judges in Harlan County, in my experience, do not remove healthy children from stable homes to satisfy a rich uncle's legal theory." He looked at Naomi. "Make sure she's healthy. Make sure she knows she's home." Elsie was already both of those things. But Naomi heard it anyway, the way you hear things that matter, not just with your ears, but with the part of you that is calculating risk at all hours. January was cold the way the mountains are cold. Serious and absolute. No negotiation about it. The ranch contracted around them, the world outside the fence line reduced to white and gray, and the dark line of the pines against the ridge. They were in close quarters in a way that the busy fall season hadn't required, and Naomi discovered things about Silas Boone that she'd had no way to learn when they were both in constant motion. He had nightmares. Not often, maybe twice a week, that she heard, and he was quiet about them. No shouting, just a sudden movement that she could hear through the floor of the loft, and then a long silence, and then the sound of him getting up and building the fire up or going out to the barn. He never spoke about it in the morning. She never asked. He was a reader. He had a collection of books on the shelf in the main room that she hadn't paid close attention to initially, and one evening she looked at them carefully, history mostly, and natural science, and 3 novels that looked well used. She pulled one out and found notes in the margins in his handwriting, careful observations about what the author had gotten right and what they'd gotten wrong about the geography of the Missouri Territory. She put it back and thought that she had underestimated the interior of this man, which was probably fair because he did nothing to invite assessment of it. He was not easy to live with. He'd been honest about that. He went quiet for days sometimes, not cold exactly. He wasn't punishing her with silence, just genuinely absent, as though he'd gone somewhere inside himself and the door was shut. During those days, he still did what needed doing, still spoke when spoken to, but he was running on some lower level of engagement with the world that she gradually learned to read and leave alone. On the other side of those quiet stretches, he would sometimes talk. Not at length, not in the personal confessional way some people had, just observations, things he'd noticed, things he was thinking about. She was a good listener, and she'd learned early that listening to Silas Boone required a different quality of attention than listening to most people, because he was saying what he meant without embellishment, and the meaning was often more compressed than she initially heard. One evening in late January, he said, without context, "Eliza used to say, 'I worked instead of talked.'" He was at the table. She was across from him, mending. "She was right," Naomi said. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yeah," he said. "Was she a talker?" Naomi said. He thought about that. "She was a laugher," he said. "Always finding things funny, even when they weren't that funny." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't laugh enough when she was here. I think about that." Naomi kept her eyes on her work. "You're laughing more now," she said. Another pause. "Yeah," he said. "I noticed that." She didn't say anything else, and neither did he, but the silence afterward was different from the silences that preceded it. The second week of February arrived without permission, the way deadlines do. They left for Harlan County on a Monday, the day before the hearing. Doris Fain had offered her house for the overnight, and they arrived in early evening with Elsie bundled in every warm thing she owned, and Luther making his opinion of the cold weather known at volume for the last mile of the drive. Doris had supper ready. She fed Elsie first and put her to bed in the spare room with a warmth that Naomi watched and felt somewhere complicated. Doris was a woman who had raised 4 children and buried 2 and kept going, and the way she handled Elsie, matter-of-fact, no fuss, just present and capable, reminded Naomi of her own mother and made her miss her in the particular way you miss people when you're about to face something difficult and they're not there. After Elsie was asleep, the 3 adults sat at Doris's kitchen table, and Carver arrived at 8 o'clock with his notes and his ink-stained hands and his pen that he kept tapping against his teeth, and they went over everything again. "Victor Hale will be there himself," Carver said. "I've confirmed that. He's bringing 2 witnesses from Iron Creek, Martha Hale and a man named Cole, the company foreman. His attorney is Preston Wade, out of the county seat. Wade is good. He doesn't do things sloppy." "What's his approach going to be?" Silas asked. "Sympathy for the child," Carver said. "He's going to argue that Elsie deserves stability and financial security and family. He's going to make Victor look like a concerned uncle who only wants what's best. He's going to make Iron Creek sound like a community that supported Naomi and was abandoned." He looked at Naomi. "And then he's going to point out that you left that community with a stranger and brought your sick child to an isolated ranch in the middle of winter." "That's one way to say it," Naomi said. "It's the way they're going to say it," Carver said. "You need to be ready for that. You need to be ready for the other things too, the debt, the living arrangement before the marriage, the speed of the marriage itself. Wade is going to suggest the marriage was arranged to defeat this petition, and technically he's not wrong." "We got married because it was the right thing for Elsie," Silas said. "I believe you," Carver said. "The judge needs to believe you. Those are different problems." Naomi had not slept well in 2 weeks, but she slept worse that night than any of them. 3 hours, maybe 4, in pieces, waking each time with the specific cold alertness of someone whose body has decided the situation requires consciousness. She lay in the dark of Doris's spare room, with Elsie's back warm against her side, and went over what she knew. She knew the truth. She had always known the truth, had lived it, had every moment of it in her body. The question was whether the truth, in a room designed for arguments about truth, was going to be enough. The Harlan County Courthouse was a 2-story stone building that smelled of wood polish and old paper. The courtroom on the 2nd floor was smaller than Naomi had pictured. 3 rows of benches, a low railing, a judge's bench that was raised just enough to make everyone standing before it feel they were being looked down at by a calculated degree. Judge Harlan Reese was 55 or 60, with white hair cut short in a manner that was neither warm nor cold, but simply precise. He moved his papers with the efficiency of a man who has made the same movements thousands of times and sees no reason to elaborate on them. Victor Hale was already there when they arrived. He was seated on the petitioner's side of the room with his attorney, Preston Wade, a broad-shouldered man with a dark coat that had cost real money, and 2 other people Naomi recognized immediately. Martha Hale, from the general store, and Emmett Cole, the mining company foreman who had handed her the debt paperwork at Daniel's graveside. Victor stood when she entered. He was Daniel's older brother by 12 years, which put him around 50, and he had the kind of face that had probably been handsome when younger and had since settled into a kind of commanding heaviness. He nodded at her with what looked like genuine solemnity. She did not nod back. She sat down beside Silas and put her hands flat on her knees and looked at the judge's bench. Elsie was with Doris in the courthouse hallway. Carver had explained that children were sometimes called into the judge's chambers privately, and they had prepared Elsie for this possibility the evening before. Not coached her, because you couldn't coach Elsie, and also because Naomi refused to, but explained what might happen and why. "What if he asks me questions I don't know the answers to?" Elsie had asked. "Then you say you don't know," Naomi told her. "You tell the truth about what you do know, and you say you don't know about what you don't. That's all. Even if the answer might be wrong?" "Your truth is never the wrong answer," Naomi said. "Just tell him what's actually true." Elsie had thought about this. "Okay," she said. "Can Aldridge come?" The cat could not come. They had compromised with a small wool rabbit that Doris had produced from somewhere in her house. The hearing opened at 9 in the morning. Wade was efficient and clear, the way good attorneys in front of judges they know well tend to be. No performance, no wasted language. He laid out the petition in about 15 minutes. Elsie Hale was the only child of Daniel Hale, deceased, and his widow Naomi Hale, now Naomi Boone. The petitioner, Victor Hale, was the child's uncle and only surviving family member on the father's side. The petitioner had the financial resources and stable circumstances to provide for Elsie's long-term welfare, while the respondent's history demonstrated a pattern of instability and poor judgment that placed the child's well-being at risk. It was presented without heat, which made it more effective, not less. Naomi sat and listened to the story of her life as Victor Hale's attorney told it, a story that used true facts to build something that looked nothing like her life as she had lived it, and she kept her hands flat on her knees and did not react visibly. Silas sat beside her without moving. She could feel the tension in him, the absolute controlled stillness of a man who was angry and was managing it with the same method he managed everything, by going very quiet. Martha Hale took the stand first for the petitioner. She was composed and firm, and she said the things Carver had predicted. Naomi had asked for credit she couldn't repay. Naomi had been seen begging at multiple establishments. The child had appeared thin and feverish on multiple occasions in the weeks following Daniel's death, and Naomi had disappeared from town with a strange man without a word to anyone. She said all of this as though it caused her pain. The performance was genuine enough that Naomi had to give her credit for it. Carver stood for cross-examination. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "when you declined to extend credit to Mrs. Naomi Hale on the day she requested milk for her feverish daughter, what other options did you suggest to her?" Martha blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Options," Carver said. "Assistance, alternatives. Given the circumstances, a widow with a sick child in a community that presumably cared about its members. What did you suggest she do?" A pause. "I told her I couldn't extend credit." "And before that?" There wasn't anything before that." "Nothing," Carver said. "Thank you, Mrs. Hale." It was a small thing, a 20-second exchange, but Naomi saw the judge make a small note and felt something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. Emmett Cole followed Martha. He spoke about the company debt in terms that implied it had been legitimately Naomi's responsibility, her husband's obligations, transferred appropriately upon his death. Carver asked to see the documentation. Cole produced it. Carver reviewed it for approximately 30 seconds, and then asked Judge Reese to note that the document transferring the debt to Naomi Hale bore no official seal from the Ridgeline Mining Corporation, only a foreman's signature, and that legal transfer of corporate liability to a private individual required the signature of a corporate officer at minimum, a requirement that this document did not meet. Wade objected. Reese looked at the document. He made another note. Cole left the stand looking like a man who had been handed something hot, and dropped it. Victor Hale did not take the stand himself. Naomi had wondered about that, and she thought she understood it now. Wade had decided Victor's presence as a witness was more liability than asset. A rich man arguing for the custody of a working woman's child looked better on paper than it did in person. Wade called one more witness, a woman named Pratt from Iron Creek, who spoke about the condition of Naomi's rented room and the general perception in town that Naomi had not been managing adequately. Carver's cross was brief. Mrs. Pratt, did you at any time during the period in question offer Mrs. Hale any form of assistance? No, Mrs. Pratt said. Did anyone in Iron Creek, to your knowledge, offer her work? Not that I know of. Thank you. Then it was their side. Silas went first. Carver had suggested this. Let the judge see the man before he sees the financial records. Let him form an impression of who Silas Boone actually is. Silas on the stand was exactly what he was everywhere else. Plain, unhurried, direct. He answered every question without elaboration and without evasion, and when Wade stood to cross-examine him and asked whether the decision to marry Naomi had been motivated by the custody petition, Silas looked at him without any particular expression and said, "The decision to marry Naomi was motivated by the fact that she was the most capable and honest person I'd encountered in 4 years, and by the fact that Elsie needed 2 legal parents to protect her from this petition. Both things were true at the same time. I don't see the conflict." Wade tried 2 more approaches and got 2 more answers that were similar in their directness, and eventually he sat down. Naomi testified for 40 minutes. Carver took her through everything: Daniel's illness and death, the company debt and its questionable legitimacy, every door she'd knocked on in Iron Creek, the decision to leave with Silas, Doris Fain's medical assessment of Elsie on arrival, the ranch's improving financial records, the marriage, and every week of Elsie's recovery since. She told it the way it happened, not performing it, not reaching for sympathy, just telling it the way it was, with the specificity of someone who had lived each moment and remembered it with the precision of a person who knew those details might someday matter. When Wade cross-examined her, he asked whether she had told anyone in Iron Creek she was leaving. "No," she said. "Wasn't that irresponsible?" "I told Hedder at the blacksmith stable," she said. "I asked him to verify Silas Boone's character before I made any decision. He told me Silas was the most straightforward man he'd dealt with in 30 years. Given that everyone else in Iron Creek had just demonstrated their own character quite clearly, I decided Hedder's assessment was worth more than a community farewell." She heard someone in the benches behind her make a sound that might have been a cough or something else. Wade pressed on the speed of the marriage. "You married Mr. Boone within 6 weeks of arriving at his ranch." "We married when we understood that Elsie's legal protection required it," she said. "I'd have married him the week I arrived if I'd known then what I know now." She meant it as a practical statement. Listening to herself say it, she wasn't entirely sure it was only that. She didn't examine the difference right now. "You would describe your marriage as a business arrangement?" Wade said. "Wade, I would describe it as a decision made with clear eyes and good reasons," she said, "which is more than I can say for most marriages I've observed." Wade made a note and moved on. He didn't get what he was looking for, a woman who seemed calculating or cold, because what she was, in fact, was honest, and honest didn't play the way calculating did in a room like this. Then Judge Reese asked to speak with Elsie. Naomi had known this was coming. Carver had told her it was likely. But the moment it was said out loud in the courtroom, something physical happened in her chest. A tightening, fast and involuntary, the body's response to the understanding that the thing you cannot control is now in motion. She went out to the hallway and crouched in front of her daughter, who was sitting on a bench beside Doris, with the wool rabbit in her lap, and the alert, slightly watchful expression she'd had since morning. "The judge wants to talk to you," Naomi said. "Just you and him, in his office." Elsie looked at her. "What does he want to know?" "He wants to know where you live, what your life is like." She paused. "He wants to know what you want." "What I want?" Elsie seemed genuinely surprised that this was a relevant variable. "Yes." Elsie thought about this. She looked at the rabbit. She looked back at her mother. "Can I take Aldridge?" she said, meaning the rabbit, not the cat. "Yes," Naomi said. "You can take Aldridge." She stood up and watched the bailiff lead Elsie down the hallway toward the judge's chambers, and then she went back into the courtroom and sat down and did the hardest thing she'd done in a year of hard things, which was to wait. Silas didn't say anything. He put his hand on the bench between them, not touching her, just there, and she put her hand next to his, not touching him either, and they sat that way for 30 minutes while the courtroom held its particular kind of silence, the kind that has weight. Victor Hale, across the room, was looking at his hands. She didn't know what he was thinking. She didn't particularly want to, but she looked at him for a moment, this man who had been her husband's brother, who had come to the wedding and measured the room and decided where she ranked in it, and she thought about what Silas had said. He doesn't want Elsie. He wants not to lose. Maybe that was true. Or maybe Victor Hale was more complicated than that, and she was simplifying him the same way he'd simplified her. She didn't know. She didn't have enough information about who Victor Hale was on the inside to make that call. What she knew was what he'd done. What she knew was that when she'd needed his help, when his brother was dying, when his niece was hungry, he had sent a polite note and then waited to see what there was left to take. That was what she knew. The door to the hallway opened and the bailiff came back with Elsie, who walked to Naomi with the particular composure of a child who has done something important and is still holding herself together from the effort of it. She climbed onto the bench and pressed herself against Naomi's side and said nothing. Naomi put her arm around her and said nothing either. 20 minutes later, Judge Reese returned to the bench. He reviewed his notes for a moment that stretched past comfortable. Then he looked up. "I've heard the testimony and reviewed the documentation in this matter," he said, "and I've spoken privately with the child." He paused. "I'm prepared to rule." The room went very quiet. Naomi felt Elsie's hand find hers under the table and hold it, and she held it back, and she looked at the judge and did not look away. "The child in question," Reese said, "is healthy, is clearly attached to her current home and her current family, and expressed her wishes clearly and without apparent coaching." He glanced at his notes. "She told me that Pine Ridge is her home, that Mr. Boone, whom she referred to as her papa, takes care of her every day, and that she does not wish to leave." He set the notes down. "She also told me," he said with something that was almost a change in his expression, "that the family cat's name is Aldridge. She said she named him after a judge because he had a similar expression. A beat." "I'm choosing to take that as a compliment." Someone in the benches made the cough sound again. "The petition for custody is dismissed," Judge Reese said. "The child will remain with her mother and stepfather at Pine Ridge Ranch. The transfer of corporate debt referenced in these proceedings is referred to the county clerk for review of its legal validity." He looked at Wade. "Counsel." He gathered his papers and left the bench. The room broke open. Carver was saying something. Doris, who had slipped in during the final testimony, made a sound from the back row. Silas stood up and Naomi stood up, and for a moment they were just standing there, the two of them, in the particular aftermath of something that had required everything and was now, somehow, over. Elsie looked up at them. "Did we win?" she said. "Yeah," Silas said. His voice was rough at the edges in a way it sometimes got when he was working hard on something internal. "We won." Elsie nodded once, satisfied, and held out the wool rabbit. "Aldridge was very brave," she said. Naomi laughed. It came out louder than she intended, surprised out of her, and she pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment and felt the tears she had not allowed herself in 8 weeks arrive all at once in a rush behind her eyes, and she let exactly 3 of them go before she stopped it, because there were things left to do and she was not done yet. She looked across the emptying room. Victor Hale was standing with his attorney. His face was composed, but it was the composition of a man who had rehearsed it, not how someone looks when they feel nothing, but how someone looks when they've decided in advance how they need to appear. He glanced at her, then at Elsie. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Regret, maybe, or something that had been regret for a long time and had calcified into something harder. She didn't go to him. This was not the moment for that, and she knew it. But she didn't look away either. She held his gaze for just a moment, steady, without anger, without triumph. And then she took her daughter's hand and her husband's arm and walked toward the door, and the autumn light came through the courthouse windows in long, cold panels, and outside the mountains sat white and enormous against the winter sky, indifferent and vast and entirely unchanged by anything that had just happened inside. That was the thing about mountains. They didn't care about your trials. They didn't care about your victories. They just stood there, and you either found a way to live in them or you didn't, and the living itself was what counted. Naomi Boone walked out of the Harlan County Courthouse and turned her face toward home. The drive back from Harlan County took 2 hours, and for the first half of it, nobody said much of anything. Elsie fell asleep against Naomi's side before they'd cleared the edge of town, the wool rabbit tucked under her chin, one boot half off her foot the way it always ended up when she slept sitting up. Silas drove with his eyes on the road and his hands easy on the reins, and Naomi sat with her daughter's weight against her and watched the winter landscape open up around them. The valley floor giving way to the climbing switchbacks, the pine ridgeline coming into view above the road, and eventually the particular granite outcropping that she had started to recognize as the last landmark before Pine Ridge came into sight. She had not cried in the courthouse. She had let 3 tears go and stopped the rest by force of will, because there had still been things to do. Documents to sign with Carver, a brief exchange with Judge Reese's clerk about the debt referral, Doris to thank properly, Elsie to collect from the hallway. By the time all of that was done, the tears had decided to wait for a better moment. And she had been grateful for that, because she didn't know what she looked like when she really cried, and she wasn't sure she wanted Silas Boone to find out. Now, with Elsie asleep and the road steady and nothing left to manage, the feelings from the last 8 weeks were beginning to move through her in a slow, unorganized way that she didn't entirely have language for. Relief was part of it. Exhaustion was most of it. And underneath both of those, something quieter, a kind of settling, like ground that has been through a hard freeze and is now finding its level again. "You were good in there," Silas said. She looked at him. He was still watching the road. "Carver was good," she said. "Carver knew the procedure," Silas said. "You knew the truth, and you told it straight. That's different." He paused. "Wade couldn't shake you." "He tried that angle about the marriage being arranged," she said. "I don't think it landed the way he intended." "No," Silas agreed. "It didn't." She thought about what she'd said on the stand. "I'd have married him the week I arrived if I'd known then what I know now." She'd meant it as a practical statement about legal protection, and she stood by that meaning. She was also aware, sitting beside him now in the cold with her daughter asleep between them, that it was possible the statement had been true in more than one direction at once, and she wasn't yet sure what to do with that information. She filed it where she filed things that required more time than she currently had. Pine Ridge looked the same as they'd left it, the house quiet, the barn latched, the east fence straight against the snow. It looked like what it was, a place someone had been taking care of. Naomi had not understood, when she first arrived, how much of her energy had been spent for the past year simply trying to survive conditions that were actively hostile. Coming back to the ranch now, after the courthouse, she understood it by contrast, the way you understand what rest is only after the exhaustion has lifted enough to let you feel the difference. Silas unhitched Luther. Naomi carried Elsie inside and put her down on the bed in the main bedroom, still half asleep, and got her boot off the rest of the way and tucked the quilt around her. The room was cold. The fire had burned down while they were gone, and Naomi rebuilt it before she did anything else, working quietly so as not to wake her daughter. She stood in the doorway for a moment after the fire caught, watching Elsie breathe. The fever that had nearly killed her in October was months gone. She had gained enough weight that Naomi had let out the seams of 3 dresses since arriving at the ranch, and then given up on 2 of them and simply made new ones. She was 4 going on 40, with opinions about everything from the proper naming of barn cats to the moral weight of different types of weather. She had recently declared that she did not trust days that were too sunny in winter, which Naomi found difficult to argue with logically. She was alive. She was home. That was the thing Naomi kept coming back to, not as a sentimental thought, but as a fact she needed to keep solid in her hands, because everything else that was true had grown out of that. She went back to the kitchen and started supper. Silas came in from the barn about 20 minutes later, stomping snow off his boots at the door, and stopped when he saw what was on the stove. "You don't have to cook tonight," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." He sat down. She could feel him watching her move around the kitchen, not in a way that was uncomfortable, just in the way of someone who is paying attention. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The debt referral," she said. "Carver thinks the county clerk will rule it invalid within the month. That means the company can't come after us for it. But it also means I should probably write to the company directly before they find out through official channels. Get ahead of it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what you're thinking about," he said. Not a question exactly. "Among other things," she said. "What are the other things?" She turned from the stove and looked at him. He was sitting with his hands around his coffee cup, watching her with that direct, unhurried attention he had. The kind that most people found unsettling, but that she had come to understand was just how he looked at things he was trying to actually see. "I'm thinking that it's over," she said. "The thing I've been carrying since that letter arrived in December. And I'm trying to figure out what I do with myself when there isn't a crisis requiring constant management." Something in his expression shifted. "Yeah," he said. "I know that feeling." She thought he probably did. She thought the 4 years he'd spent working this ranch alone after losing Eliza and the boy had been a sustained version of the same thing, all energy directed outward into necessary tasks, because directing it inward was not survivable. And then she had arrived with her daughter and her 3 pennies and her ledger reading and her Wednesday trips to Tillman's, and things had started requiring a different kind of attention. She turned back to the stove. "The east pasture fence is going to need another section replaced before spring," she said. "I know," he said, "and the root cellar's going to be low by April, at the rate we're going. We need to plan the spring planning to get ahead of that." "Naomi," he said. She stopped. "The fence will get fixed," he said. "The cellar will be fine. You're allowed to just—" He stopped, seeming to look for the word. "Sit with it for a day." She turned around again. "I don't know how to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not great at it either." He looked at his cup. "But I've been working on it." The following weeks had a different quality than anything that had preceded them at Pine Ridge, though Naomi couldn't have said precisely what had changed. The work was the same work. The days had the same structure. But something in the atmosphere of the place had shifted, as though a sustained tension that she hadn't fully registered while it was present had released, and the absence of it changed the acoustics of everything. She noticed small things. She noticed that she was sleeping through the night without waking at 3 in the morning to run through lists of what still needed handling. She noticed that meals had started taking longer, not because the cooking was slower, but because they stayed at the table longer after eating, and conversation had started happening in the way it happens when people stop treating talk as a logistical tool and start treating it as something else. Silas told her about his father one evening in late February. Not a planned thing. They were cleaning up after supper and he was drying a pot. And he said, without looking up, that his father had been a difficult man, stubborn and exacting, and that Silas had spent most of his 20s trying to earn approval from him, and most of his 30s coming to terms with the fact that the approval was not forthcoming because his father didn't actually know how to give it. "He came to the ranch once," Silas said, "after Eliza and I had been here 3 years. He walked around the whole place without saying anything, which was his way. Then at supper he said the fence line on the north pasture was too far left. He set the pot down. Didn't mention anything else." "What did you say?" Naomi asked. "Nothing. I knew he was right about the fence." He picked up another pot. "But it was a good ranch. We'd built something real, and he walked around the whole thing and found the one thing that was off." Naomi was quiet for a moment, drying her own pot. "My father used to say that people who can only see what's wrong are usually people who are afraid to see what's right," she said, "because if they admit something is right, they lose their leverage." Silas thought about that. "He was a smart man, your father." "He was," she said. "He was also absolutely infuriating when he was right about things, which was most of the time." Silas almost laughed. She was getting better at identifying the moments when the laugh was going to happen, but didn't quite make it, and she had stopped being disappointed by them because she'd realized that the almost laugh was its own expression, one that said something about how much he'd let in without knowing it. March came in like it wanted to prove something, with 3 days of hard wind and a snowfall that took out a section of the barn roof that Silas had been watching and hadn't gotten to in time. They spent 2 days repairing it, Silas on the roof, Naomi below handing materials and holding what needed holding, and it was cold, bad-tempered work that required a level of coordination they'd had to develop on the fly. At one point she handed him a board at the wrong angle, and it caught the wind and nearly took them both off balance. And he caught it and said something under his breath that was not polite. And she said something back that was not polite either, and for about 30 seconds they were both genuinely irritated with each other in the specific way that comes from being cold and tired and working too close together under difficult conditions. Then the wind dropped for a moment, and the silence was so complete after the noise that they both stopped and looked at each other, and Naomi started laughing, and Silas shook his head and the irritation was over. "You're better on a roof than you should be," he said, when they were back on solid ground. "I patched my father's store roof every fall for 6 years," she said. "He was afraid of heights." "What was he afraid of?" "Heights, loud noises, women who talked back." She pulled off her work gloves. "He married one anyway. Said it was the best decision he ever made." Silas looked at her. That expression was on his face again, the one she'd been seeing more often lately. Not quite a smile, something more considered than that, as though he was looking at something and deciding whether he was allowed to say what he was thinking. He didn't say it. He picked up the leftover materials and went to store them in the barn. And she went inside to start on supper, and nothing was said. But the thing he hadn't said sat in the kitchen between them at supper, the same way it had been sitting in rooms between them for weeks now, present, identifiable, waiting with what she was beginning to think was more patience than either of them actually had. It was Elsie, of course, who broke it. Elsie had a gift for saying the true thing at the precise moment everyone else was working to avoid it. It happened on a Sunday in late March, after supper, when the three of them were at the kitchen table with nothing urgent requiring attention. Elsie was drawing something on the back of an old supply receipt. Silas was reading. Naomi was repairing the heel of a stocking. Elsie looked up from her drawing and said, to no one in particular, "Do you love Mama?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a very long time when everyone in the room is trying to figure out what to do with it. Silas set his book down. He looked at Elsie with the careful attention he always gave her direct questions. "Why do you ask?" he said. "Because you look at her like Papa used to look at the mountains," Elsie said, as though this were an obvious explanation. "Like you're glad they're there, but you're also a little scared of them." Naomi kept her eyes on the stocking heel. She could feel her face doing something she didn't have complete control over. "Is that right?" Silas said. It wasn't quite a question. "Papa said mountains are the most beautiful things in the world and also the most dangerous," Elsie said. "He said that's why people look at them that way." She went back to her drawing. "So do you?" Another 4-second silence. "Yeah," Silas said. "I do." Naomi bit a thread and did not look up. Elsie nodded, satisfied. "I thought so," she said. "You can tell her. She won't be scared." Naomi finally looked up at that, because she couldn't not, and found Silas already looking at her with an expression that was not careful and controlled and measured for the first time since she'd known him. It was just open, the way a door looks when someone has stopped deciding whether to close it. "She's right," Naomi said. "I won't be." Elsie continued drawing without any apparent awareness that she'd done something significant. The cat, Aldridge, jumped onto the windowsill and knocked a tin cup off it, and Elsie shrieked and Silas caught it, and the moment broke open into something ordinary, but different ordinary than before. The kind of ordinary that's been rearranged at the level below surface. Later, after Elsie was in bed and the house was quiet, Silas found Naomi on the porch in the cold, looking out at the mountain line against the night sky. He came out and stood beside her without a coat, which she considered a tactical error given the temperature. "You'll freeze," she said. "I'll be quick then," he said. He looked at the mountains. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I should say that up front. I did it once before and I left things unsaid that should have been said. I don't want to do that again." She turned to look at him. His jaw was set the way it got when he was saying something that cost him something to say. "Then say them," she said. "I think about you," he said. "Not the ranch, not the work. You, specifically. I think about you when you're in the next room, and when you're across the table, and when I'm out on the fence line and you're nowhere near." He paused. "That's new. That hasn't happened in a long time, and I didn't go looking for it, and I'm aware that the situation is complicated. We got married for legal reasons. I know that." "We got married for legal reasons," she said. "That's true." He looked at her, waiting. "And I think about you," she said, "specifically, when you're in the next room." She watched his face. "That's also true." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's enough for me. For now. If it's enough for you." "It's enough," she said. He nodded. The set of his jaw relaxed slightly, the way something does when it's been braced against a possibility that didn't happen. He looked back at the mountains. "Go inside," she said. "You're actually going to freeze." "I'm fine." "Silas." He went inside. She stayed on the porch for another few minutes, long enough to feel the cold properly, and to think about what had just been said, and to decide what she thought about all of it. What she thought was that this man had walked around with something locked up inside him for 4 years, and had begun, carefully and reluctantly, to open the parts of it that still worked, and that she was not going to rush that or demand more of it than it was ready to give. What she also thought was that she had been carrying her own locked things for longer than she'd admitted, and that the process of unlocking was slower and stranger than she'd expected, and also, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, exactly right. She went back inside. Silas was at the table with his book. He looked up when she came in. "The Tillman's order for next month," she said, hanging up her coat. "I was thinking we should double the flour order and get ahead of the spring baking." "Good idea," he said. "And the north pasture fence needs looking at before the thaw makes the ground soft. Last fall's repair may not hold. I'll check it Monday," he said. She sat down across from him. He went back to his book. She picked up the stocking she'd been working on. The fire was warm. The house was quiet. Outside, the mountains sat in the dark the way they always sat, patient, enormous, entirely indifferent. Inside, something was different. Something had been said and acknowledged and set down in the place where things that are real live, and neither of them was going to pretend otherwise or rush it toward anything it wasn't ready to be. April arrived and the snow began in earnest to pull back from the lower elevations, revealing the mud season that everyone in the mountains regarded with a combination of relief and resignation. The ground was soft and difficult. The ranch roads turned unreliable, and the work that had been contained by winter started expanding in all directions the way work does when the season gives it room. Naomi expanded the kitchen garden. Not just maintained it the way it had been when she arrived, let out its borders, reworked the soil in the sections that needed it, planned the beds with a forethought that the previous year's chaos hadn't allowed. She ordered seeds from 2 different suppliers and compared them against what Doris Fane grew in her valley garden and adjusted accordingly. She also started keeping a different kind of account book alongside the ranch's financial records. Not money, a record of what the garden produced, what they used, what they traded to Doris and the 2 other households they'd fallen into a loose exchange with over the winter. The record was practical, but looking at it, she could see something else in it, the shape of a life that was building rather than just enduring. Doris came to visit in April, driving her own wagon up the ridge road with a load of early vegetable starts, and the unapologetic directness of a woman who considers herself entitled to check on people she cares about. She walked around the ranch with Naomi in the cool April morning and made observations in the way she made everything, bluntly, with precision, without much concern for whether the observations were welcome. "The place looks different," she said. "We've done a lot of work," Naomi said. "It's not the work," Doris said. "The work was always getting done. It's the—" She gestured with one hand, an encompassing sort of motion. "The shape of it. It looks like a place where people live, not just where someone's keeping things going." Naomi considered that. "I know what you mean," she said. "He seems better," Doris said. This meant Silas. With Doris, pronouns attached to the person she was thinking about regardless of whether she'd said the name. "He is," Naomi said. "Still quiet." "Still quiet," Naomi agreed, "but different quiet." Doris looked at her sideways with the expression she got when she was deciding whether to say the next thing. She said it. "You're good for each other. I don't say that about people often." "I know you don't," Naomi said. "He needed someone who wouldn't treat him like he was fragile," Doris said. "And you needed someone who could actually handle you, which most people couldn't." Naomi wasn't sure if that was a compliment. She decided to take it as one. That evening, after Doris had gone and Elsie was in bed and the kitchen was quiet, Naomi told Silas what Doris had said about the ranch looking like a place where people live. He thought about it. "She's right," he said. "It didn't before." "Before I came?" Before you came, he said. He looked at the table for a moment. I was maintaining it, going through the motions of keeping it operational. That's different from... He stopped and she watched him look for the word with the deliberate patience of a man who doesn't use words carelessly. From caring, he said. I'd stopped caring about the place, about whether it was actually good. I was just keeping it from getting worse. Naomi was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing, she said. Keeping things from getting worse when you're doing it alone, that takes everything you have. He looked at her. Yeah, he said, it does. A pause. But it's not the same as this. No, she said. It's not. She looked at him across the table, this man who had stopped a wagon in the middle of a street because he saw a child who looked like the one he'd lost, who had quietly written to Carver before she even knew there was a plan, who had stood in a courtroom and told the truth without embellishment or performance, who had said, I think about you, and then gone inside because she told him to and trusted that it would be enough. She thought about what her father had said about her mother. Best decision he ever made. Said it like it was simple, the way people say things that took them years to understand are true. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at it, then up at her, and didn't say anything, because neither of them needed to say anything, and they'd both figured out by now that silence between people who understand each other isn't empty. The account books were balanced, the fence was repaired, the root cellar had been restocked, and the spring planting was planned, and the debt referral from the county clerk had come back exactly as Carver predicted. Invalid. The company's problem, not hers. Victor Hale had sent a letter in March. She had read it twice, standing at the kitchen table with the morning light coming in at a low angle, and then she had set it down and told Silas what it said. Victor had written that he intended no further legal action. He had written, in the careful language of a man who is not accustomed to admitting things, that he believed the court had ruled correctly. He had written that he hoped, in time, Elsie might know something of her father's family, if Naomi was willing. What do you want to do? Silas asked. She had thought about it. She had thought about the wedding and the calculated smile and the 3 pages of legal threat and the attorney who had told the judge a true story that was also a lie by omission. She had thought about Elsie, who would grow up and ask questions about her father and about Daniel Hale, who had been Victor's brother before he was anyone's husband or father, and about the particular cruelty of denying a child knowledge of where she came from because the adults around her couldn't manage their own history. In time, she said. Not now, but in time, yes. Silas nodded. All right, he said. She wrote back to Victor in April. It was a short letter, not warm, but not cold, honest in the way she had learned to be honest, which was without performance in either direction. She said that Elsie was well and growing. She said that the door was not closed. She said that what came next would depend on what he chose to do with the opening. Then she folded the letter, sealed it, put it in the Wednesday supply bag for Tillman's to post, and went out to the garden where the first of the spring seedlings were pushing up through the turned earth, small and determined and entirely indifferent to the difficulty of what they were doing. She crouched down and looked at them for a moment. She had come to Pine Ridge with 3 pennies and a sick child and no certainty about anything past the next hour. She had built something here, not from ideal materials, not on good timing, not with the benefit of anyone's support or approval or assistance except Silas Boone's wagon and Doris Fain's medical knowledge and Hedder's 30-second character reference. She had built it out of what she had, the same way the seedlings were building themselves out of the cold April earth, not because conditions were favorable, but because the alternative to growing was simply not growing, and that was not a choice she was willing to make. She stood up, brushed the soil from her knees, and went back to work. The spring that followed the trial was the first season Naomi had lived through in years without waiting for something to go wrong. That was not the same as things not going wrong. Things went wrong regularly. The north pasture fence that Silas had checked in March failed in May anyway, during a stretch of warm rain that softened the post holes faster than anyone anticipated, and 30 feet of it went down in a single night and 3 of the cattle got into the neighboring tree line and took half a day to locate. The well pump developed a fault in its leather seal that required 2 trips to Harlan for parts, and a full day of work in standing water that left Silas with a cough that lasted 2 weeks. The kitchen garden, which Naomi had planned with such care through the winter, lost an entire bed of early beets to a late frost in April that no one had seen coming. These things happened, and they were dealt with, and then the next thing happened, and was dealt with too. The difference was that none of it felt like a threat to the foundation anymore. It felt like weather. It felt like the ordinary difficulty of a life that was actually being lived, as opposed to a life that was being survived while the real question, whether any of it was going to last, remained unanswered. That question had been answered in February, in a courthouse in Harlan County, by a 5-year-old girl with a wool rabbit under her arm and a cat named after a judge at home. By June, Elsie had turned 5 with a small gathering on the porch that included Doris Fain, a neighboring family from 2 miles down the ridge named the Calloways, who had 3 children roughly Elsie's age, and Carver, who arrived from Harlan with a tin of hard candies and a slightly baffled expression that suggested he didn't attend many children's birthday celebrations and wasn't entirely sure of the protocol. Elsie managed him with the easy authority she brought to most situations. She told him to sit next to the youngest Calloway child and handed him a piece of cornbread and informed him that the cake was for after, not before, and that the rule at Pine Ridge was you had to eat something real first. Carver looked at Naomi with the expression of a man who has just been given instructions by a 5-year-old and cannot decide whether to be amused or impressed. "She runs a tight event," he said. "She runs everything tight," Naomi said. "We've learned to work with it." Silas was at the far end of the porch talking to Cal Calloway, who was a broad, slow-talking man with a laugh that arrived from somewhere deep and took a while to get out. Naomi watched them for a moment. Silas, who was not a natural socializer, who had spent 4 years essentially alone and had to reconstruct the muscle of being around people from scratch, and noticed that the conversation looked easy, not forced. Silas was leaning against the porch post with a cup of coffee and actually listening to Cal in the way he listened when something interested him, with his full attention on the other person and none of it on managing the interaction. That was new. Or rather, it was old, something that had come back. The Calloways had come into their orbit in March through Doris, who seemed to function as a kind of informal clearinghouse for everyone within 10 miles who needed to know someone else. May Calloway was 32, sharp-eyed, and 8 months pregnant with her 4th child, which she discussed with the cheerful pragmatism of someone who has been through the process enough times to have stopped finding it remarkable. Their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ranging from 4 to 9, treated Pine Ridge on their visits as a territory to be explored and assessed, and Elsie treated them with the proprietary dignity of the person who lived there, and therefore set the terms. It worked somehow. The children worked out their own hierarchy within about 20 minutes of the first visit and had maintained it with only occasional renegotiation since. May Calloway's 4th child arrived in late June, another boy, which May received with the same cheerful pragmatism, and Naomi drove to their place 3 days after the birth with food and supplies and spent the afternoon doing what needed doing while May rested. It was not a dramatic thing. It was just the obvious thing, the thing you did when someone nearby needed help, and Naomi did it without thinking much about it. On the drive home, she thought about Iron Creek. She thought about the closed doors and the 3 pennies and the particular silence of a room full of people who had decided someone else's trouble was not their problem. She thought about how different a single act of ordinary human decency would have looked to her then, how enormous it would have been, how much it might have changed what she'd had to do. She thought about this not with bitterness, not anymore, but with the clarity that comes when you've had enough distance from a thing to see its actual shape. Iron Creek had taught her something important. It had taught her that community was not a given. It was not something that existed automatically because people lived near each other. It was something that had to be chosen, repeatedly, by people who were willing to pay the small cost of noticing someone else's difficulty and deciding it mattered. She had not found that in Iron Creek, so she was building it here the way she'd built everything else at Pine Ridge, without fanfare, without a plan she'd written down, just by doing the next obvious thing and the one after that. It was Doris who said it plainly, the way Doris said most things, on a warm July afternoon when they were both in Naomi's kitchen putting up the first of the summer preserves. "You've made yourself into the person you needed when you got here," Doris said, stirring something on the stove without looking up. Naomi was labeling jars. She stopped and thought about that. I suppose I have, she said. It's what the good ones do, Doris said. The ones who make it, not just survive, actually make something. They look back at what was missing when they needed it, and they decide to be that thing. She tapped the spoon on the pot's edge. The ones who don't make it stay angry about what was missing, which is understandable, but it doesn't build anything. Naomi went back to her labeling. Are you saying I'm not angry anymore? I'm saying your anger got converted, Doris said, into something more useful. She glanced over. You're still capable of it. I wouldn't want you to think I'm calling you soft. I know better than to think that, Naomi said. Doris almost smiled, which for Doris was the equivalent of anyone else laughing out loud. The summer was the fullest season Pine Ridge had seen in years. By every measure Naomi had been tracking. The garden produced past what she'd projected. Not because the projections were wrong, but because the soil, properly worked for the first time in several seasons, turned out to have more in it than the neglect of the past few years had suggested. She expanded the preserving operation, built a proper drying rack on the south side of the house, where the afternoon sun was reliable, and by August had enough put up to carry them comfortably through to spring and still have a surplus. The surplus became the point. She started distributing it in September. Not as charity, she'd learned enough about the people in this range of the mountains to know that the word charity arrived weighted with implications most of them didn't want anything to do with. She did it as trade, or as the first movement in a trade, or simply as the giving of a thing with the understanding that it would come back in some form when it could. Cal Calloway fixed their pump housing in October and refused payment, which Naomi accepted, having sent enough food to his household over the summer that the accounting was already settled in some informal ledger they both understood without discussing. A family named Greer arrived in August, 3 weeks after the birth of their 5th child, and 6 weeks after losing most of their cattle to a respiratory illness that had moved through the valley. They had a homestead 4 miles north, closer to the ridgeline, and they were in the specific kind of trouble that combines a new baby with a catastrophic loss of livelihood, not falling apart yet, but close enough to the edge that a single additional bad thing could tip them over. Naomi heard about them from May Calloway. She drove up to the Greer place on a Thursday with a load of preserved food and seed stock and spent an hour with Helen Greer, who was 26 and exhausted in the way that goes past tired into something more fundamental. The exhaustion of a person who has been holding too many things at once for too long and is starting to lose their grip. Naomi recognized it the way you recognize something you've lived. She didn't perform sympathy. She set the food down on the table and asked what Helen needed most right now, and Helen said, "Someone to talk to who isn't trying to tell me it'll all work out." And Naomi said, "I'm not going to tell you that," and sat down. She stayed 3 hours. She didn't fix anything. The cattle were gone and the baby was colicky, and the homestead had a leaking roof that was going to be a problem when fall came. Those were facts. And facts didn't change because someone sat with you and acknowledged them. But when she left, Helen Greer looked different than when she'd arrived, in the specific way that people look when someone has taken their situation seriously without trying to diminish it. 2 weeks later, Silas and Cal Calloway drove up to the Greer place with materials and a day's labor and patched the roof. They didn't make a production of it. They came and did the work and came home. "You didn't tell me you were planning that," Naomi said that evening. "You didn't tell me you were going up there either," Silas said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with that direct, unhurried attention. "Cal mentioned the roof when I saw him at Tillman's," he said. "I had the materials. It wasn't complicated." It wasn't complicated. That was the thing about Silas Boone. He had grown up believing that actions were what counted, not the accounting of them. And he had never stopped believing that even in the years when it had become very difficult to act on anything. Now that the difficulty had receded, he had gone back to the original operating principle with the simplicity of someone returning to a road they'd always known. She thought about what she'd said at the courthouse, to Wade, when he'd asked if she'd describe her marriage as a business arrangement. "I would describe it as a decision made with clear eyes and good reasons." She stood by that. She'd meant every word. She also knew now, with a certainty that had arrived gradually and without announcement, that it had become something else as well, something that had no satisfying legal or practical description. something that lived in the specific way he handed her coffee in the morning before she asked for it, and in the way she automatically left the account books open on the side of the table closest to him when there was something she wanted him to see, and in the way Elsie said goodnight to both of them in the same breath, as though there had never been a version of the night that didn't include both. Victor Hale came in October. Naomi had been expecting it and not expecting it. She had written that the door was not closed, but she'd held the question of whether he would actually walk through it at a careful distance, because hoping for a thing and being disappointed was a cost she'd paid too many times to run it up unnecessarily. He wrote first, in September, to ask whether a visit would be acceptable. His letter was different from the legal correspondence, shorter, less precise, with the slightly uncertain quality of a man writing in a register he didn't use often. She read it twice and showed it to Silas. "What do you want to do?" Silas asked. The same question he'd asked in March, when the first letter came. "I want Elsie to know her father's family," Naomi said. "That hasn't changed." She paused. "And I want to see whether the man who wrote this letter is the same man who hired Wade to tell a judge I was an unfit mother." "They might be the same man," Silas said. "People can be both things," she said. "I've been both things. So have you." He acknowledged that with the small nod he used when she'd said something that landed. Victor arrived on a Saturday morning in October, driving a hired wagon from Harlan. He was alone. No attorney, no witnesses, just himself and a driver who waited at the gate while Victor walked up to the house. Naomi met him at the door. They looked at each other for a moment, the two of them, on the porch of Pine Ridge Ranch in the October air, with the mountain ridge visible above the tree line and the smell of preserves still coming from the kitchen. He was not quite what she remembered. The courthouse, from a distance across a room, had shown her one version of him, composed, deliberate, the man who measured every room. Up close, on her ground, he looked older than she'd expected, and there was something in his face that wasn't there at the wedding. She didn't have a precise word for it. Reduced, maybe. Not in a defeated way, but in the way of a man who has been through a process of recalibration and come out the other side with less certainty than he started with. "Mrs. Boone," he said. "Mr. Hale," she said. A beat, then, "Thank you for letting me come." She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." Silas was in the kitchen. He and Victor Hale shook hands with the wary efficiency of two men who understand exactly where they stand relative to each other and have decided to be civil about it. The civility was genuine, she thought, not performed, just the acknowledgement that whatever had happened in February was over, and the only question now was what came after. Elsie was at the table with her drawing things. She looked up when Victor came in and assessed him with the focused attention she brought to new arrivals. "You're my uncle," she said. Not a question. Victor looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not the composed public shift, but something private, something that arrived quickly and was not quite managed before it showed. "Yes," he said. "Your father was my brother." Elsie looked at him for another moment. "Do you look like him?" Victor sat down. "A little," he said. "Around the eyes." Elsie nodded as though this confirmed something she'd been considering. "Mama has pictures," she said, "but they're small." She turned to Naomi. "Can I show him the picture?" Naomi went and got the small photograph from the tin box. Daniel at maybe 25, in his mining clothes, squinting against bright light. She put it on the table in front of Victor. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. His hand moved toward it and then stopped, like he'd changed his mind about touching it. "He hated having his picture taken," Victor said. His voice had changed register. "He always looked like he was bracing for something unpleasant." "He is squinting," Elsie said, leaning in to look. "Mama said it was sunny." "It was probably sunny," Victor said. The conversation that followed, the 3 hours Victor Hale sat at the kitchen table at Pine Ridge Ranch, was not easy and was not comfortable and was not the kind of conversation that resolves everything. There were things said and things not said, and at least 2 moments when Naomi could feel the old anger move through her, not the hot anger of the immediate aftermath, but the colder, more considered kind, the anger that knows exactly what it's about and why, and chooses carefully whether to speak. She chose twice not to speak. She let the moment pass and said something else and moved the conversation on. She chose once to speak. Victor said something, carefully, in the precise language of someone who has rehearsed it, about having believed at the time that his concerns about Elsie's welfare were legitimate. Naomi looked at him across the table and said, "Your concerns about Elsie's welfare would have been easier to believe if they'd arrived before you needed them to be useful in a legal proceeding." Victor was quiet. He looked at the table. "That's fair," he said. It was the right answer, not sufficient. The word fair was doing a lot of work in that sentence, standing in for several things that couldn't be said in front of a 5-year-old. But it was honest. And honesty from Victor Hale had, in her experience, been a rationed commodity. By the time he left in the early afternoon, something had been established. Not warmth. Warmth was a long way off and might never arrive in full, and Naomi was not going to pretend otherwise, but the possibility of something workable, a structure within which Elsie could know her father's brother without that knowing requiring Naomi to pretend the past year hadn't happened. She watched the hired wagon go down the road from the porch, and Silas came to stand beside her, and they watched it together until it went around the bend in the tree line. "Well," Silas said. "Well," she said. "He's not what I expected," he said. "No," she agreed. "He's not what I expected either." She thought about it. "He's someone who did a bad thing and knows it. That's different from someone who did a bad thing and doesn't." She paused. "It doesn't undo it, but it's different." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You're more charitable than I would be." "I'm not charitable," she said. "I'm practical. Elsie is going to ask about her father for the rest of her life. I'd rather she ask someone who's standing in our yard than someone we've never given her access to." He looked at her sideways. "You've thought about this for a while." "Since March," she said. He nodded. Then he went back inside, because there were things to do. And that was what you did. You had the difficult afternoon, and then you went back inside and continued with the work. October deepened. The harvest came in and was stored. The preparations for winter had a different quality this year than last. Not the frantic catching up of a person arriving in the middle of someone else's neglected season, but the steady, organized work of people who had spent a full year building toward this moment and knew what they had and where it was. Elsie started helping in the garden in a serious capacity that fall. Not the child helping of the spring, supervised and limited and mostly decorative. She had opinions now about which beds needed what, and had been following Naomi's account of the garden's productivity with the focused attention she gave anything that interested her, which turned out to be most things. She was, Naomi was beginning to understand, the kind of child who was going to be exhausting and remarkable in equal measure for the rest of her life. And the thing to do was not to manage that, but to aim it. "She asked me yesterday why we plant the turnips next to the brassicas," Silas said one evening. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know, and she should ask you." "She didn't ask me," Naomi said. "She probably went to look for the answer herself," Silas said. He said it without any particular emphasis, but with the small note in his voice that she'd learned to recognize, the one that meant he was quietly pleased about something. "She found one of the farming books on the shelf. She was reading it this afternoon." Naomi looked at him. "She can't read that." "She was looking at it very seriously," Silas said. "I didn't interrupt." Naomi thought about her daughter, 5 years old, sitting with a farming reference book she couldn't possibly read, working on a problem that had interested her, refusing to not try. She thought about where Elsie had been a year ago, feverish and thin and too quiet, in a rented room above a blacksmith's stable in a town that had no use for either of them. She didn't let herself feel the full weight of that contrast very often, because it was too large, and she was a practical person, and the past was not the point. But she let herself feel it for a moment, standing in the kitchen of Pine Ridge Ranch in the October evening with the preserves on the shelf and the fire going and the account books balanced, and Elsie in the next room studying something she couldn't read but was determined to understand. The past was not the point, but it was the measure. You had to know where you'd started to understand what you'd built. She thought about the woman who had stood outside a general store in Iron Creek with 3 pennies and a sick child, and the absolute absence of any reason to believe anything was going to improve. She thought about what that woman had known and not known. Had known that she wasn't going to give up, had not known that there was a man on a wagon 2 minutes away who was going to see her daughter and recognize something in her that he'd been carrying for 4 years and couldn't set down. Had not known about Pine Ridge, or Doris Fane, or the Callaways, or what the soil in the kitchen garden could produce when it was properly attended to. Had not known any of that. Had climbed onto the wagon anyway. People talk about courage like it's a feeling, like the courageous person feels brave and therefore does the brave thing. In Naomi's experience, it was almost never like that. The courageous thing was usually done by someone who was afraid and exhausted and had run completely out of better options, and it looked from the outside like a decision, but felt from the inside like the only thing left that made any sense. She had not felt brave outside that general store. She had felt 3 pennies in her palm and a child burning with fever against her chest, and she had felt the absolute clarity of someone who has been reduced to what is actually true, with everything else stripped away. What was actually true was, she was not going to stop. She was not going to let her daughter starve in a town that had decided they didn't matter. She was going to do the next possible thing, and the one after that, until either something worked or she had genuinely exhausted every option, and she had not yet exhausted every option. The wagon had been the next possible thing. Everything else had followed from that. This was what she understood now, a year later, that she had not understood clearly enough then. Survival is not the victory. Survival is the precondition. The victory is what you build after you survive, who you become, what you make from what you have, whether you take what was done to you and let it define what you do to others. She had been given a lesson in what a community was not. She had decided, without making a statement about it, to build the version that actually worked. The November afternoon when she understood this most clearly was not a remarkable afternoon by any external measure. She was in the kitchen. Silas was outside doing something to the fence. Elsie was at the table with the farming book, still working on it a month later, and Doris Fane had stopped by on her way through from the Greer place and was drinking coffee at the table across from Elsie, reading her own mail, as comfortable in Naomi's kitchen as someone who had been coming there for years. Helen Greer had sent a short note with Doris. The cattle loss in the summer had been partially recovered through a purchase arrangement Cal Calloway had brokered on their behalf. Cal knew a man in the valley who was selling a small herd at a fair price, and the Greers had managed it with a loan from the informal network of exchange that had developed over the summer between the households on this stretch of the ridge. It was not a perfect situation, but it was a working one, and a working situation was all anyone in the mountains could reasonably ask for. Naomi read the note and felt something that she'd have called satisfaction if the word were large enough. "She sounds better," Doris said, without looking up from her own mail. "She does," Naomi said. "She told me last week she's going to put in a proper kitchen garden next spring," Doris said. "Asked me to recommend a seed supplier." "I'll write down the ones I use," Naomi said. "She already knew you'd say that," Doris said. "She said she was going to ask you herself. I told her you'd probably just drive up there with the seeds." "I probably will," Naomi said. Doris made a sound that was approximately an affectionate sound filtered through a woman who had made it her policy not to be openly affectionate. "You're going to fill up this whole mountain with people who owe you things," she said. "I'm not keeping accounts," Naomi said. "I know," Doris said. "That's what I mean." The afternoon light came through the kitchen windows at the angle it only reached in late fall, low and long, and the particular gold that belonged to this season alone. Elsie was tracing a diagram in the farming book with her finger and explaining something to Aldridge, the cat, who had jumped onto the table and was being used as an involuntary audience, in a serious, instructional voice. Silas came in from outside, stomped his boots at the door, assessed the kitchen with the quick survey he always did, checking that everything was as it should be, which it was, and poured himself coffee and sat down. He looked at Elsie and the cat and the farming book and didn't say anything, but the corner of his mouth moved. She was going to keep thinking about that, about the way a person's face changes when they've come back to something. Silas Boone had been a man maintaining things, holding the line, keeping it from getting worse for 4 years. And then she had come with her 3 pennies and her dying daughter and her ledger reading and her complete refusal to be anything other than exactly what she was, and something in him had started moving in a direction other than simply forward and nothing more. She did not believe she had fixed him. She had not fixed him. He had a grief in him that was going to be there for the rest of his life. The particular grief of a person who lost a child has no clean resolution. She knew that. She'd watched it from close up for a year now and understood its shape. He still had the nightmares sometimes. He still went quiet in ways that shut the door. But he also laughed now, the real laugh that she'd heard for the first time on Elsie's birthday in June, surprised out of him by something Cal Calloway said, arriving fully and without reservation, the laugh of a man who had given himself permission to find something genuinely funny. She had stored that in the same place she stored the things that mattered. She took it out sometimes and looked at it. December came, and with it the first snow of the new winter, and the ranch settled into the particular quiet of a place that knows what it is and doesn't need to prove it. The root cellar was full, the fence was straight, the animals were tended, the account books were balanced, and there was a surplus in them for the first time in Silas's records going back 4 years. On the evening of the first hard snowfall, Naomi stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard going white in the last light. Elsie was in bed, had insisted on staying up to watch the snow start and then fallen asleep before it finished, which was how it usually went. Silas was behind her at the table, reading, the lamp throwing a small circle of yellow light that reached as far as the edge of her shadow. She thought about the October afternoon on the wagon, coming north out of Iron Creek on a road she didn't know, with a man she'd known for 40 minutes and a child who was getting sicker. She thought about how the world had looked then, stripped to its essentials, clarified by crisis, into a very simple question. What are you going to do right now with what you actually have? She had answered that question. She was still answering it every day, which she suspected was the real work of any life. Not the single dramatic choice that everyone remembers as the turning point, but the 1,000 small choices that follow it. The daily decision to show up and do the next possible thing and care about whether it's done well. That was what no one told you when they told you about people who built something from nothing. They talked about the wagon ride and the trial and the moment everything changed. They didn't talk about the Wednesday trips to Tillman's or the November afternoon patching a roof in the rain or the way you had to learn someone's silences before you could understand what they meant, or the slow work of becoming the person that someone else's life required you to be. The dramatic moments were real, but they were made possible by all the unglamorous ones. The courage of getting on the wagon was real, but it was made of the same material as the courage of getting up the next morning and fixing the fence and making the next hard decision and the one after that. She had been carrying 3 pennies, and she had built Pine Ridge. Not alone, she understood that clearly and did not romanticize her own role in it. Silas had been here. Doris had been here. Carver had known the procedure. Hedder had handed her a bottle of milk and told her what she needed to know. The Calloways and the Greers, and even, eventually, Victor Hale, standing in her kitchen looking at a photograph of his dead brother. All of it was part of what had been built here, and none of it was only her. But she had made the choices. She had gotten on the wagon. She had read the account books and made the trip to Tillman's and sat across a kitchen table from a woman who needed someone to take her situation seriously and stayed 3 hours. She had stood in that courtroom and told the truth without performance. That was hers. Nobody could take the choices from the person who made them. "Snow's sticking," Silas said from behind her. "I know," she said. "I'm watching it." She heard him set the book down and push back his chair. He came to stand beside her at the window. He was close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. "We're ready for it," he said. He meant the winter, the stores, the animals, the roof. "We are," she said. She looked at the snow coming down in the dark outside the window, covering the yard and the garden beds and the fence posts and the mountain road until everything was the same color, the same patient white that buried the frontier every year and waited to see what survived it. She had survived it. She was going to keep surviving it. More than that, she was going to keep building. The garden in spring, the seeds she'd promised Helen Greer, the expanding circle of what Pine Ridge had become, one ordinary act of decency at a time, until the place that had once been a man holding the line against grief had become something the mountains around it could actually be proud of. She did not say any of this out loud. It was not the kind of thing she said out loud. It was the kind of thing she simply knew, standing at a window in December with snow coming down and a lamp burning behind her and her daughter asleep in the next room and the man beside her close enough to touch, knowing that tomorrow the fence would need checking and the animals would need tending and there would be 10 other things that required her full attention. She would give them her full attention. That was all. That was everything. The snow kept falling, Pine Ridge kept standing, and Naomi Boone, who had once been Naomi Hale with 3 pennies in her hand and no reason to believe any of it was going to work out, stood in her own kitchen in her own life and let the quiet of it settle into her like something she had finally decided she was allowed to keep.